Remember those movies you watched as a kid? The ones that gave you nightmares?
Yeah.
We're diving deep into those.
Oh, this is going to be good.
We asked you guys for the movies that left a lasting impression, and you did not disappoint.
Not at all.
Mm,
People have some strong feelings about these films.
seriously. You've sent over some fascinating observations about how some of these seemingly innocent films really messed with our young minds. Expert speaker, I'm ready to unpack this. Where do we even begin?
Well, first of all, it's amazing to me how many people vividly remember being terrified by specific scenes or characters, even decades later.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like these films really tapped into something primal.
Right, making a lasting impression on viewers.
Totally.
Yeah, and it's not just passing fear. I mean, these discussions are full of people talking about how these movies affected them long term.
I can believe it.
Like being afraid to swim in the ocean because of Jaws.
Oh, classic.
But let's back up a bit.
Hmm.
One big theme that kept popping up is death and loss,
Interesting.
particularly in animated films.
Yeah.
We're talking gut-wrenching scenes like Bambi's mother or the emotional roller coaster of The Fox and the Hound.
Right. Everyone remembers those.
What's going on there? Why hit us with such heavy stuff at such a young age?
It's interesting, isn't it? You wouldn't expect children's films to be a crash course in mortality. But when you think about it,
Right.
these stories could be a way to help kids process complex emotions like grief and loss, even if it's on a subconscious level.
Makes sense. It's like dipping their toes into those big, scary life questions, but in a way that feels safe because it's just a movie.
Exactly.
But then you have films that went beyond the sadness of loss and straight into unsettling territory, like Return to Oz.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, electroshock therapy.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Return to Oz is a great example of a film that seems to intentionally subvert the lightheartedness of its predecessor.
Totally.
The 1985 film deliberately embraces a darker, more unsettling tone, which really shocked a lot of viewers.
Yeah.
The Wheelers, with their fused bodies and creepy laughter, are a perfect example.
Oh, man.
Those visuals, paired with the eerie sound design, are just burned into people's memories.
You're right. The sound design is spot on in that film. The way the Wheelers move and laugh still freaks me out to this day. It's amazing how sound can amplify fear, even when the visuals are already pretty disturbing.
Absolutely. Think about the iconic heavy breathing in Alien, or the whispering voices in The Exorcist.
Oh, yeah.
Our brains are wired to respond to auditory threats,
Right.
and filmmakers know how to use sound to tap into our deepest fears,
Totally.
creating a sense of unease that lingers long after the film ends.
Speaking of lingering unease, we have to talk about the never-ending story. Artax sinking in the swamp of sadness.
Oh, come on.
I mean, come on, that scene was practically a rite of passage for kids of the 80s. Why do you think that scene in particular has resonated with so many people for so long?
It's a perfect storm of emotional manipulation, even if unintentional. You've got this beautiful, loyal creature succumbing to despair, the slow, agonizing sinking, the mournful music all expertly crafted to evoke a visceral response.
Totally.
And it worked. People still talk about how they had to fast forward through that scene as adults because they couldn't handle it.
And it's not just the sadness, it's that feeling of helplessness.
Oh, I know.
Like, you want to believe Atreyu can save him, but deep down you know it's hopeless. That's heavy stuff for a kid to process.
Exactly. And that feeling of helplessness ties into another recurring theme in these discussions: fear of the unknown. The never-ending story is full of strange and unsettling creatures like the Jimork. And let's not forget those creepy wolf-like creatures in the woods.
No.
It plays on that very primal fear of what we can't see or understand.
Okay, but sometimes it wasn't even the creatures themselves, but the situations they represented. Like, I don't have arachnophobia, but that movie Arachnophobia, I slept with a can of Raid under my bed for months.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
These films often tap into our real-world anxieties, even if they use fantastical settings: fear of spiders, fear of the dark. Those are things everyone can relate to on some level.
Totally. But then you have those films that took a sharp turn from fantasy into something that felt way too real, like The Witches.
Oh, gosh.
Casually depicting child murder. Who thought that was okay?
The Witches, along with films like Return to Oz and even Watership Down, which features some pretty graphic scenes of animal cruelty, definitely sparked a lot of discussion about how cultural norms have shifted. Were filmmakers in earlier decades less concerned with shielding children from darker themes?
Right.
Or were those films simply products of their time? reflecting a different sensibility.
It's a fascinating question, and it makes you wonder, did those films shape our understanding of the world in ways we don't even realize? I mean, I still can't look at a bowl of mashed potatoes the same way after Close Encounter.
It's funny how those early cinematic experiences can stick with you. But you're right, these films weren't just entertainment.
Right.
They were often our first encounters with complex themes like death, fear, and even societal anxieties.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting for me. We've been talking about how these films affected us as kids,
Right.
but what about revisiting them as adults?
Yeah.
Do we still find them disturbing? Or does nostalgia soften the blow?
Nostalgia definitely plays a role.
Okay.
For many people, rewatching these films brings back a flood of memories, both good and bad.
Yeah.
The disturbing elements might even seem quaint or even humorous now,
Right.
adding to the overall nostalgic experience.
Like that creepy troll in Ernest Scared Stupid.
Exactly.
As a kid, nightmare fuel.
Yeah.
As an adult,
Yeah.
hilariously bad special effects.
Exactly. But for others, the disturbing elements remain just as potent, if not more so, because they understand the implications and subtext on a deeper level. Take Who Framed Roger Rabbit, for example.
Oh, okay.
That scene where the shoe dissolves in the dip. As a child, you might focus on the visual gag.
Right.
As an adult, you recognize the horrifying symbolism of death and destruction.
It's like those films grow up with you revealing new layers of meaning as you gain more life experience. Speaking of growing up, we haven't even touched on what I think is one of the most fascinating aspects of all this, the generational divide. Would these films even be considered appropriate for children today?
It's a great question, and there's no easy answer.
Right.
Societal norms and expectations around children's entertainment have definitely evolved. We're much more sensitive to violence, potentially traumatic content, and even the way certain groups are represented on screen.
Sure.
Parents today might think twice before showing their kids The Witches or even The Land Before Time with its intense opening scene.
Right. And it's not just about shielding kids from darkness. It's about how we approach those darker themes. Do we sanitize them, make them more palatable for younger audiences?
Right.
Or do we embrace the idea that children can handle complex emotions and themes even if they don't fully grasp them?
And that's where the debate gets really interesting.
Yep.
Some argue that over-sanitizing children's entertainment does a disservice to kids.
Okay.
They say it prevents them from developing the emotional intelligence to deal with the world's complexities. Others believe that children are more vulnerable than we realize, and we need to be mindful of the content they're exposed to, especially at a young age.
It's a tough balance.
It is.
But regardless of where you stand on that, one thing's clear. These seemingly innocent kids' films had a profound impact on our generation. We're still talking about them, dissecting them, and debating their merits decades later.
Absolutely. I think that speaks to the enduring power of storytelling.
Yeah.
Whether they were intended to or not, these films sparked conversations, challenged our perspectives, and even helped us make sense of the world around us.
So what does this all mean? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into childhood trauma disguised as entertainment? For me, it really drives home the point that these films, even the ones that scared us silly, really stuck with us. They became part of our shared cultural DNA.
Yeah, I totally agree. And, it's not just about the fear factor. These films often introduced us to complex emotions and ideas, even if we didn't fully grasp them at the time. It's like they made us think, question, and sometimes even confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the world around us.
We've been focusing on movies that were clearly intended for kids. But what about those films that people misremember as being kid-friendly? The ones that snuck in under the radar and kind of messed us up in ways we didn't even realize until much later?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, The Dark Crystal immediately comes to
Ah.
mind. The Henson magic is undeniable, but those Skeksis,
Whoa.
pure nightmare fuel, even for adults.
Right. It's like someone said, let's take a kid's movie about puppets and inject it with a heavy dose of existential dread. Visually stunning, but man, that film goes to some dark places.
It really does. Makes you wonder what they were thinking marketing that to children.
Right.
And it also highlights how our memories can be selective, especially when tied to childhood. We might remember the catchy songs or the funny animal sidekicks, but the darker, more disturbing elements just fade into the background.
Until you rewatch it as an adult and you're like, wait a minute, how did I miss that as a kid?
Mhm.
It's like those films were playing on a whole different level that we weren't even aware of.
That's what makes this whole topic so fascinating.
Right.
It's like a cultural archaeology project, digging through these layers of memory and meaning to understand how these films shaped who we are today.
And maybe even understand why we're so drawn to dark and disturbing stories in the first place. So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the surprisingly dark side of our childhood favorites, any final thoughts for our listeners? What should they take away from all of this?
Hmm. I'd say don't be afraid to revisit those films that scared you as a kid.
Oh, good one.
You might be surprised by what you discover, not just about the films themselves, but also about how your own perceptions have evolved.
And who knows? You might even find a new appreciation for those films that gave you nightmares. Maybe there's a reason they've stuck with you all these years. Thanks for joining us on this trip down memory lane. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and maybe sleep with the lights on.